on behalf of the Bridgman Public Library, I want to welcome everyone to tonight's program. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping things. You may notice that you're all muted to begin with, and so we will leave everyone muted until there will be a question and answer period after Marnie's presentation. If you want to send messages through the chat, I will be monitoring the chat questions, so I can, sorry, I'm still admitting folks, that's good. People are still coming. We like to leave the door open. So, but I will be monitoring the chat and I can feed those questions to Marnie as well. So, and as I mentioned earlier, we will actually open the question and answer period after the program. So again, welcome. Tonight's speaker is Marnie Keenan. She's the author of the book, The Snow Killings. She's an award-winning journalist. She retired in January of 2017 after 26 years as a reporter and columnist at the Detroit News. So The Snow Killings is about the unsolved murder of 4 children in Oakland County in the mid-1970s. Over 13 months in 1976 and 77, 4 children were abducted in Oakland County and held for days before their bodies were dumped in the snow near public roadsides. And the murders spawned panic across Southeast Michigan and triggered the most extensive manhunt in US history. And then the case went cold for more than 30 years. Then in 2009, Marnie broke the story about the most promising suspect to ever emerge in the case. And that suspect was Christopher Brian Bush, the son of a prominent GM executive and a 27-year-old 4-time convicted pedophile. Bush had been investigated by the task force, the task force assigned to solving the crime at the height of the crime spree, but then he was set free. And only weeks after he was set free, the last victim, whose name is Timothy King, went missing too. So Marnie followed the story for the news thereafter, and The Snow Killings is the result of a 10-year mission to uncover the real truth about what happened to these 4 children and to provide answers for the loved ones of the victims. So Marnie, welcome. And yes, we're eager to hear the depth of the story that you have to tell us. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Marnie.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Dennis, and to the Bridgman Library for helping me put this together. I was explaining to Dennis that I often have a hard time looking at the camera and instead want to look at the person I think I'm talking to. So you'll forgive me for that. This is a complicated story. It's very dark and it's very tragic on many levels. But I stuck with it and spent many years reporting and researching it, despite the, the atrocity that is sexual crimes against children, because I feel no matter how many experts deem this case to be unsolvable, that may be true, but the truth still matters. And it matters not just to the loved ones of the victims, it matters to all of us, especially when people in positions of power abuse that power and then try to conceal their misdeeds to save face. So I prepared a slideshow to take us through the story. Over the course of 13 months in 1976 and 1977, 4 children from Oakland County, one of the most affluent counties in the country, were abducted, held captive from 4 to 19 days. Their bodies were dropped by public roadsides. Ranging in age from 10 to 12 years old, Mark Stebbins, Joe Robinson, Christine Mihalik, and Timothy King were all killed by the same malevolent person who came to be known as the Oakland County child killer. And I'm afraid, there we go, sorry. The killer's first prey was Mark Stebbins, who was 12 years old. Mark was from Ferndale, and he was walking home from the American Legion Hall at around 1 p.m. on February 15, 1976, when he disappeared. His body was found 4 days later, lying on his back against an office building wall in Southfield. On December 22nd, 1976, Jill Robinson had been looking forward to spending Christmas with her two younger sisters. She had bought them each a present. Jill was sweet and smart and loved to read, but something was bothering her that night. And when Jill's mom asked her to help make biscuits, Jill stormed out the door in an adolescent huff. She left her mom's home in Royal Oak on her bike, presumably on her way to her father's house in Birmingham. A friend of Jill's mother's said she thought she saw Jill riding her bike on a sidewalk down Woodward Avenue, headed north. Jill was reported missing later that night. In the first 48 hours, police treated Jill as a runaway, which pained her parents deeply. Carol, Jill's mother, told the media, "Just because we are divorced does not mean that each of us love our daughter any less." 4 days later, on the day after Christmas, Jill's body was discovered on the side of I-75 near the Big Beaver exit in Troy. Like Mark, she had been dressed in her own clothes and was wearing her backpack. She had been shot in the face. Since the other three children had been suffocated, police theorized that Jill had likely been smothered. But when she was laid down on the side of the road, her backpack forced air out of her lungs, and the killer thought she might still be breathing. And so he grabbed a gun. Just 1 week after Jill's body was found, Christine Mihalik walked to the 7-Eleven store on 12 Mile Road in Berkeley to buy a Tiger Beat magazine because it had her idols on the cover, Donnie and Marie Osmond. Christine was held the longest. After 19 days, a mailman in Franklin saw something in the ditch sticking up out of the snow. It was Christine's hand. After Christine's death, police realized they had a serial child killer on their hands and formed what came to be known as the Oakland County Child Killings Task Force. Less than 2 months later, on the evening of March 16, 1977, Timothy King borrowed 30 cents from his big sister and walked 3 blocks from his home in Birmingham to buy candy at the neighborhood drugstore. He never returned. As soon as Tim was reported missing, law enforcement canvassed neighborhoods on foot. Helicopters with powerful searchlights scanned fields, alleys, and vacant warehouses. Within hours, a task force of over 300 detectives canvassed the neighborhoods. Helicopters circled overhead like vultures. Over the weekend, L. Brooks Patterson, the Oakland County prosecutor at the time, authorized police to pull over all the cars on the roads in Oakland County between the hours of 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. It was highly unusual. It was also blatantly unconstitutional. But it was thought that since the other 3 children had been killed right before their bodies had been dumped, it was hoped that they could intercept the killer and possibly find Tim alive. In all, 2,000 cars had been pulled over with nothing to show for it. One officer did say that no one who had been pulled over had complained. Tips flowed into police. One of them was from a woman loading groceries into her car the night Tim went missing. She told police she thought she saw Tim talking to a man standing in the parking lot next to a blue gremlin. Sadly, the gremlin would turn out to be one of the biggest red herrings in the case. 6 days later, with a kind of macabre consistency, two 19-year-olds speeding down a gravel road spotted a flicker of red in the snow in the ditch. It was Tim's hockey jacket. His skateboard had been tossed nearby like an afterthought. Stoic and strong, Marion King was said to be particularly close to her youngest child. In a plea to Tim's captors, published in the newspaper, she wrote, "Wherever Tim is, he's distressed about worrying me. He has always left notes or called to tell me where he is." We okay?
Yep, you're good. Sorry, Marnie.
Not at all. I don't know why this isn't working, but it's not. There we go. At the funeral, Tim's teammates sat in the front pew, all dressed in their red hockey jackets, their shoes dangling inches above the marble floor. From a perch on the balcony, plainclothes police officers surveyed the mourners below for anyone suspicious looking. Wow. This has never happened before. I'm really sorry. Sorry about this, you guys.
No, you're
After the funeral, Marion became a warrior, soldiering on because, as she said, "I've got 3 other kids to raise." She wanted no part of the investigation. She did not want any media attention. Barry King abided by his wife's wishes. Sporadic updates from law enforcement, though devoid of any serious leads, led him to believe that police were doing all they could. After Tim, playgrounds emptied, traffic jams piled up at school dismissal time. No child would be walking home alone. Even playing in the backyard required parental supervision. Because there was no commotion heard, no screams of help, it was thought that each child went with their captor willingly, that they must have recognized whoever was luring them in. As a result, everyone was suspect. Teachers, coaches, ministers, cops. Tips lit up phones like Christmas trees. I don't know why. I'm sorry.
We're still hearing you just fine, Marnie.
Yeah. There we go. I don't know why it's doing that. I'll just continue to try.
Yeah. Okay.
Despite the largest manhunt in U.S. history at the time, as many as 18,000 tips and close to $1 million, the task force failed to make even one arrest. By December 1978, the task force shut down. The case gathered dust for more than 30 years. Until a Livonia detective named Corey Williams had his own providential intersection with the case. He would go on to become the lead detective in the case, spending the last 14 years of his career devoted to solving it. Corey Williams was well acquainted with the unsolved OCCK case. Growing up in Berkeley, Corey's father, Lee Williams, had worked the case as a detective when Christine Mihelic went missing. In fact, Lee Williams was a good friend of Christine Mihelic's grandfather, whose name was Bob Bell. Bob Bell called his good friend Lee Williams the night Chris went missing. He was frantic, pleading for Lee Williams to help. Corey answered the phone that January night in 1977. He remembers overhearing his father trying to calm Bob Bell down. He remembers lying in bed at night and talking with his brothers about what they would do to try and get away from the killer should it happen to them. Lee Williams worked the case with a vengeance. Decades later, Corey would be on the same case, recognizing names of officers that his father worked with, desperate to solve the case his father could not. Oh, this is really frustrating.
Yeah, we still hear you okay.
I know, I'm sorry.
Okay.
There we go. And it, in 2005, Corey Williams was assigned to investigate a 13-year-old cold case murder of a Xavier Giller, the owner of the Detroit Cab Company. While reading the case files, Williams zeroed in on a suspect in Xavier Giller's murder. That suspect was Richard Lawson, who was on the run from Giller's murder when he was picked up for robbery in a small town in Pennsylvania. Lawson tried to negotiate a deal with the Pennsylvania cops. He told them he would give them information on the snow killings. The Pennsylvania cops had no idea what he was talking about. But of course, Williams knew that the OCCK case was also called the snow killings because the kids disappeared whenever it snowed. Williams now had two very good reasons to track Lawson down. Lawson was not only a killer, he was a prolific pedophile who was very active in a child pornography ring that was operating in the Cass corridor in the 70s. At the time, the 10-block inner city area just northwest of downtown Detroit had been hard hit by the recession. The area had become a haven for the sex and drug trades. When Williams caught up with Lawson, it turns out he did know a lot about the snow killings. In fact, he told Williams he and others were prostituting children to quote unquote rich executives in the suburbs. You know, I just have to get somebody to help me with this because 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
I need your help right away.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
This is my tech person. See. There, but see, yeah, okay. I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
Well, just hit the.
Oh, I know. So can you stay here for a minute?
Go ahead.
Okay. Again, my apologies. For 3 years, Williams unraveled a large prostitution and child pornography ring operating in Southeast Michigan. Williams was able to identify several hundred men belonging to a structured organization broken up into hidden cells, much like the terrorist cells we think of today. The leaders of these cells had organized lieutenants and sergeants. Williams was able to identify local politicians, labor leaders, auto executives, and even a US senator who was involved in sharing kids. There we go. Financing this child pornography rings both in the Cass corridor and on a private island in Lake Michigan was Francis Sheldon, a millionaire pedophile from an influential family in the Grosse Pointes. In 1959, Sheldon purchased North Fox Island in Leelanau County near Traverse City. Sheldon would fly children in his private plane to and from the island. Once there, children were coerced into sexual acts and then filmed and photographed. The film would be shipped to Amsterdam to the same international child porn distributor used by those in the Cass corridor operation. Police were tipped off to the island's operation via the arrest of a Sheldon underling, a Port Huron, Michigan teacher named Gerald Richards, who was charged with sexual child abuse in 1977. Richards tipped out his boss and Sheldon fled the country before arrest warrants for him were ever issued. He hid out in the Virgin Islands for a while and managed never to be extradited to the US. He died in 1996. Williams also found a direct link from the Cass corridor ring to the Oakland County child killings through a pedophile named Theodore Lamborghini. Lamborghini had helped shuttle children from the suburbs to the Cass corridor. Kids from the suburbs were considered quote unquote delicacies. Williams' investigation successfully put Lamborghini behind bars for life on sexual assault convictions involving over a dozen young boys. Lamborghini definitively failed a polygraph on the abduction and murders of the 4 Oakland County children, but he refused to tell what he knew, saying only God has forgiven me. He even went so far as to refuse an offer that would greatly reduce his sentence, even if he was the killer, to bring closure to the case. But Lamborghini turned it down. Instead, he pled guilty and secured himself 3 life sentences. In October 2009, Barry King, the father of the 4th victim, Timothy King, summoned me and my editor to his house. He was then in his late 70s, still practicing law. As we sat down, the first thing he said to us was, "The story I'm about to tell you began in that big white house across the street where a friend of Tim's lived." 3 hours later, he said, "My family and I think we know who killed Tim." The boy who lived across the street was Patrick Coffey. Coffey was a childhood friend who had been so profoundly affected by Tim's abduction and murder, he grew up to become a polygraph examiner. In July 2006, Patrick had just given a presentation at a conference at the American Polygraph Association in Las Vegas. Larry Wasser, president of the Michigan Association of Polygraph Examiners, was at the conference and went to compliment Patrick on his presentation. When Patrick relayed to him the story of how his career ambition had been born out of the tragedy of his childhood friend, Wasser said he knew the case. In fact, he told Coffey, he tested the suspect who had confessed to the crimes. In doing so, Wasser had violated attorney-client privilege. As soon as he said it, he likely regretted it. He would go on to deny the conversation had ever taken place. Detective Williams and the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office served Larry Wasser with an investigative subpoena in an effort to produce the name of the suspect he said had confessed. Finally, in late 2007, after months of legal wrangling through the courts, Larry Wasser negotiated a deal whereby he gave clues to Detective Williams to help unearth the name in exchange for not having to produce a name under oath. That name was Christopher Brian Bush. Christopher Bush was a convicted pedophile, the son of a prominent GM executive who had never seen the inside of a jail cell. During the time the murders were being committed, Bush had been charged and later convicted 4 times with criminal sexual conduct with a minor in 4 counties in southeastern Michigan, including Oakland County. But thanks to his wealthy father, H. Lee Bush, who was also the chief financial officer for General Motors, his son Christopher got probation on all 4 cases and never spent a night in jail. Bush had hired Jane Burgess, who flew around the state in the family private-owned airplane, to arrange plea deals for her client. The Bush family home in Bloomfield Village was located within a 5-mile radius of all 4 victims. Sadly, the conventional thinking that the child killer was some monster from an outside area changed to something more sinister. He lived and breathed among us. It is worth noting that despite his own handwriting insisting that Christopher Bush not receive any plea deals, to this day, Richard Thompson, the former assistant prosecuting attorney who now heads up the Thomas More Law Center in Ann Arbor, insists that he does not remember the name Christopher Bush, nor that he walked free, nor that he interviewed him as a suspect in the case. Oh, I thought we had it. I don't know.
Take a deep breath. Maybe it'll correct.
Thank you for your patience. Gregory Green was Bush's friend and fellow predator. They were both arrested in early 1977 and charged with raping a 14-year-old boy. Under interrogation, Green said that Chris Bush had murdered. There is some discrepancy in the records over whether Greg Green was out on bail while awaiting trial on charges in Flint, but no one can deny the resemblance of a police sketch from a witness who saw Tim King talking to this man. This is what power and money and influence gets you. As soon as Flint police discovered Chris Bush was from Birmingham, they alerted Oakland County Task Force and Chief Prosecuting Attorney Richard Thompson, whose signature you just saw. He rushed to Flint to interrogate Bush and Green. But for the same charge with the same boy, Gregory Green received $75,000 bail and was eventually sentenced to prison for life. But Chris Bush got his $75,000 bail reduced to $1,000. He passed a polygraph and was let go. Weeks later, Timmy King went missing. In late November 1978, a year after the child killing stopped, Christopher Bush was found dead in his Bloomfield Hills home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head with a hunting rifle. Police maintained Bush committed suicide, but the evidence said otherwise. There was no blood spatter on the walls. Christopher Bush's blood alcohol level, 0.41, was lethal in and of itself. And the sheets and blankets were pulled up as if he had been sleeping, not as if he had just put a bullet into his head. There was no shotgun residue on his hands, yet an unredacted version, you know what? This is the photo, but an unredacted version of this photo shows a bullet entry wound right between the eyes. Above the record turntable next to a print of a foreign city was a hand drawing of a young boy, scotch taped to the wall. On the left is a police sketch of Mark when he went missing. Ruth Stebbins, a single mom of two boys, Mike and Mark, had been struggling financially and thus had been unable to afford class photos of Mark when he went missing. The sketch on the right is of a young boy wailing, has the same coat that Mark was wearing, the same hairline. Those ropes on the floor of the walk-in closet, when magnified, appeared to have been blood-stained. Altogether, the scene looked staged. And yet, Bush's body was cremated 2 days later. 6 months later, the house was sold. A month after Bush's death, the task force closed up shop, saying it had run out of money. James Vincent Gunnels grew up in the same neighborhood as Chris Bush's nephews. He was 13 years old when he was molested by Christopher Bush and Gregory Green. And while Gunnels was definitely a victim, he is also thought to have been a lure in a car, young enough to perhaps attract young boys to come closer to the passenger side window. In March 2009, Vince Gunnels' mitochondrial DNA was found to have the same profile consistency as a hair fragment found on Christine Mihalik's sweater. Shortly thereafter, Vince failed a polygraph on Christine Mihalik's abduction and murder, but Vince Gunnels refuses to talk about what he knows. He has said he has no idea how that hair connected him to Christine. He has said he was in Bush's car a lot and maybe it transferred there. In 2009, Detective Sergeant Corey Williams briefed Oakland County Prosecutor Jessica Cooper on all the evidence he had amassed against Chris Bush and Greg Green, but she was not impressed. Thereafter, she downplayed the Chris Bush lead and said, "We don't charge dead people." Thereafter, she fought Barry King's FOIA request for the Chris Bush files all the way to the Supreme Court. She succeeded in having Williams removed from task force twice, and she suggested that Barry King, the father of a victim of a murdered child, was senile. Around November 2009, Cooper decided to take the reins of the investigation by forming what she called a quote-unquote newly reconstituted OCCK task force. After all, Cooper said, it is the Oakland County child killer case. In January 2010, blockbuster DNA evidence connecting hairs found on the bodies of Tim King and Mark Stebbins were found to be consistent with a hair found in the vehicle of a 1976 suspect now in prison. And this suspect was a convicted pedophile who was hunting his prey in Oakland County at the time of the killings. This was huge, the strongest scientific evidence in the case ever to emerge. But these DNA results were hidden from Wayne County. The prosecutor, Kim Worthy, Detective Corey Williams' boss at the time, was told that the evidence didn't exist. Nothing had come back from the FBI lab in Quantico. For more than 9 months, this falsehood was kept alive by the leaders of the quote-unquote Oakland County Child Killing Task Force. For all intents and purposes, the investigation had been hijacked out of pure political ambition so that only one law enforcement agency would have a better chance of solving one of the most notorious cases in Michigan history. Wayne County was forced to subpoena fellow officers of the law to appear in court and release the DNA results they had earlier insisted did not exist. This is Art Sloan. Art Sloan was sentenced to life in prison in the 1980s for the rape of a young boy, and he's been there ever since. Much to the surprise of the entire public, it was announced that Sloan in 2012 had become a central figure in the case. It turns out that in February 1976, when Mark Stebbins' body was found in the strip mall and the case was on television, Sloan's probation officer was watching. He called the Southfield police and suggested that they take a look. So when they questioned Sloan, they also impounded his vehicle, a burgundy Bonneville with a black top. They recovered hairs and fibers from his Bonneville. And 4 decades later, one of those old slides from the Bonneville was tested at the FBI lab in Quantico. And that hair has the same mitochondrial DNA consistency of the 2 hairs in the OCC case. One found on the clothing of Mark Stebbins and one found on the body of Tim King. It has been said that whoever shed those 3 hairs is our killer. This is what Art Sloan looks like today. He too has been offered early release on a tether in exchange for information that would help solve the case, but he refuses to talk. Investigators are convinced he knows something. He failed the polygraph on Tim King, but he cannot figure out how not to implicate himself. Apparently, being identified as the Oakland County child killer is worse than being behind bars for the rest of his life. And that's the end of my slideshow. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm going to end with 2 short points. Sort of my theory, in part, on why this case has been so difficult to solve, and I think one of the biggest reasons is because the cover-up is to blame. That suicide scene in 1978 was so staged that task force officers that were called to the scene well remembered all the blatant evidence that seemed to scream child killer. One officer told me, "We thought for sure that this was the guy. We just assumed that the head of the task force at the time was going to take all the evidence back and process it." But instead, as soon as law enforcement realized they had arrested Christopher Bush, but then let him go, only to have Tim King go missing weeks later, someone high up in the task force decided to bury the Chris Bush files. They had to save face rather than risk letting a terrorized community know they had committed a grave error. Someone decided that the public should never know. The investigation amounted to something worse than a massive investigative failure. It was sabotaged, the most critical evidence deliberately concealed. Neither the ligament or the ropes found on the closet floor or in the Mark Stebbins drawing have ever been located. Remember, we were never supposed to know about Christopher Bush. Had that conversation between two polygraph examiners, one a childhood friend of Tim King's, never have taken place, we would not be sitting here. I would have not written this book. No one would have ever known about Christopher Bush. And I believe that was all by design. That was the plan. His family wanted to protect their reputation, and the task force at the time did not want the community to know that they had screwed up. And the second thing I wanted to impart upon you is that I believe this case will be solved one day, either by advances in DNA science or better yet, by people coming forward. Since my book has been published, we've had several people come forward, all of them courageous. Some are witnesses, some are victims. Because we know that the truth dies in darkness, I would encourage you to talk about the case, keep it in the public's consciousness. The memory of these 4 kids deserve for the truth to surface. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Marnie, thank you so much for telling a very complicated and difficult story. And thank you for the research you did to put together what would become this book. I did want to say, I do see that there was one question in the chat. Is it all right if I read that too?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So this is from Thomas. Was there any evidence that John Hastings was involved in with any of these suspects?
Yes, I mean, we know that John Hastings lived right around the block from Christopher Bush. And he was investigated as a suspect. There's 2 times actually, in the 80s as well as recently in 2008. He was living in Atlanta, and Detective Corey Williams went to polygraph him there. John Hastings has a very curious past. He was involved with a cyber sleuth by the name of Helen Dagner, who has since passed away, and she really should be credited for all that. She put up a website and a discussion forum on the case, and she long maintained that John Hastings was the Oakland County child killer. He had met with her several times at a big boy restaurant in northern Michigan, and he claimed to know. He drew maps of where the kids were abducted and where they were dropped, and he claimed to know things about the killings that no one else knew. But when Detective Williams went to interview him in Atlanta, he pressed him, and John Hastings apparently admitted to Detective Williams that he had strung Helen Dagner along, and that he really didn't have evidence that of the case that nobody else had. It's bizarre, really. All of John Hastings' stories are bizarre, and we're hoping that now that there's a new prosecutor in Oakland County, and she ran on a platform of protecting and keeping children safe, and we're hoping that maybe she'll take some action on this case.
Absolutely. Are there questions for Marnie? I'm at least.
Yeah. Can you hear me? I'm Bob.
Yes, Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. One of my main concerns here that I've seen on this has happened twice in these books is Frank Sheldon and exactly when he left the country. And I think he's still here. I think the evidence kind of shows that, because when Gerald Richard was arrested in July, they didn't
Yes.
put out a warrant for Sheldon's arrest till December. Okay, and
Right.
he has a letter of resignation postmarked from Cranbrook Institute, postmarked the end of November, and
Right.
it originates from Kearney, New Jersey, where his buddies Dyer Grossman and I forget the other guy's name, Starkchild,
Yeah.
were from. Now, I believe the worst mistake he made and what needs to be verified, and this showed up on one of Kathy's blogs recently, the very information that he sent a letter of resignation to Boys Republic. It was postmarked from Detroit 2 days before Chris's body turned up. To me, that places him right there, square in the middle of all this. He's not in Holland yet. And the way I look at this, I think he's the guy behind all this, and that the killing stopped when he finally did leave the country. And that wasn't until after Tim. But I think that piece of information right there places him right in Detroit. I think he's the guy you're looking for. I've looked at this thing all over, and that's just the kind of conclusion I came up with. I think people need to go back and look at those letters he was sending out. He sent some from Miami. He sent the first Cranbrook resignation letter at the end of October. And one day later, postmarked from Miami, also his letter to that boy in Michigan that he had an affair with for a long time, the guy who killed himself. And that was
Yes, I know him.
Yeah, that was in Miami. So that's kind of the trail he went. But his warrant wasn't until December. He's still in
right. And there were sort of warring counties, that St. Clair County and Washtenaw County, that were waiting for each other to press charges.
Yeah, I think
I don't have to tell you that money and power, and he financed both operations, not only.
I suspect that he was paying those guys off to hold up on that warrant. That's kind of what
I wouldn't doubt it. But let me tell you something. I've never seen the letters that you're referring to. I know that he sent a letter resigning from Cranbrook, and I would love to see those letters and to see those postmarks if indeed you have them. I'm in touch with
if they have them, they would have DNA. I suspect they don't have them, because
so where do you get these letters?
Okay, these come from Marilyn Wright, in her article. She has that listed, and she has a second article that she wrote a year later. I think that's where she actually lists the date of the postmark of that letter, and it's from Detroit.
Okay, I'll I tell you what, I'm gonna I have all of Marilyn Wright's articles, and I don't remember seeing them, but that doesn't mean they're not there.
Yeah, it shows up on Corey Williams' report too,
and those postmarks, and I will post them on my website.
Yeah,
and maybe you can contact me on my website, and I will get Kathy involved, and we can clear this up, because it also shows up on the Kathy's blog and Corey Williams' report. He has that long, extensive report, and I have that report, and it doesn't show up in that report.
Yeah, Kathy posted these just a few days ago, and there it was. It was that exact. It didn't list the exact date, but it was in the time frame that one of the officers that were investigating were posting and astounded. The Boys Republic notified them that they had received a resignation letter from Frank Sheldon, and that they notified the police, and that's where they knew about that. And that was he was in Detroit, So this guy's pretty sharp, this Frank Sheldon. I'll tell you what, he's operating in the background and all this stuff. I think he's running the show on this thing, and he's very slippery. I think people really need to go back and with a detailed eye and look at his history, and it really is very disturbing. His entire historical period, buying that island, putting a airplane thing on there, landing strip, and and he's like the major pornographer in the entire country for boys in it. Oh my God! And I think he had, in my opinion, the intelligence and organizational skills and contacts to pull this off. The other guys are just a bunch of dumb bums. The Chris Bushes and that. They don't have the criminal sophistication that I think it took to do this. They're part of the gang. They're the kidnappers and the disposers. But I think the real guy, the guy at the top, was Frank Sheldon, and the guys below him were Lamborghini and Bobby Moore.
Mhm.
Those are the key guys, I believe. After looking at all this, that's the conclusion. I could be totally wrong, but I just don't think that. I think Frank Sheldon was still in the country, and I keep saying that he's not going. He's right there. He's the guy, you know. So I get, and the key thing is he tied in with these Cass Quarter guys? You know, the odd thing
So
is,
I think, Bob, it's really worth me looking into it. And I also think maybe we could let some other people.
oh, okay, I'm sorry, I get kind
Yeah,
of.
we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So
Thank you, Bob.
So a question from Thomas, didn't one of these suspects also own a Pontiac Tempest that could have been confused with a Gremlin?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had mentioned that the Gremlin was unfortunately a horrible red herring. After Christine Mihelik's body drop, a police officer went and measured, since the car that dropped her body off backed itself into a snowdrift. A police officer went and measured the exhaust and the back of the car. And long story short, he was able to determine that the vehicle that did make those impressions were either a Tempest of that year or a Skylark of that year. Unfortunately, it took a really long time to get the proper identification of the vehicles out to the public, and the myth of the Gremlin has been one that's very hard to dispel.
Yeah. There's another, thank you, Marnie. And thank you for your questions, folks. So I have another question. This is a question from Noel. Says Kathy King Broad's site has recently strongly suggested that Everett Fisher Jr. was involved. And can you comment on that?
Yes, the person that had an awful lot of information on Everett Fisher first contacted Barry King. I think it was like in 2014, and Barry asked that I talk to this person, and I got in touch with him, and we were supposed to have dinner. And the week before we were supposed to have dinner, he passed away. Apparently it was a heart condition. Long story short, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request on Everett Fisher, and the paperwork that I got back revealed that he had had 3 or more tips called in on him. One in which he was asked to say where he was during the time that Tim King was missing, and his girlfriend at the time provided an alibi. It's his girlfriend's son who was the person I was supposed to be in touch with. The thing about this case is that even now we are finding suspects that that very well might have been involved. There were an awful lot of people, as sad as it is, and as horrendous as it is to think about, the number of pedophiles in the area and just swarming around is astounding. And the child pornography business was a highly secretive, underground, multi-million-dollar industry. And they were very successful. And as I say, they operated completely underground. And, you know, and it was right underneath our noses in the Cass Corridor. And sometimes I think our denial is partly to blame, because who would have ever thought that something this abhorrent and repulsive was happening? And it was, you know, and it was, and it does still. You know, just look at the Catholic Church or Jerry Sandusky, or, you know, people say that Francis Sheldon was, you know, or that Jeffrey Epstein modeled his operation and his island after Francis Sheldon. Just
Wow.
bizarre and wicked, you know.
Yeah. Well, and Marnie, I have another question. This is from Jeremy. Says, I've seen pictures of Greg Green and John Hastings, and in some ways they both resemble the composite photos. My question is, there was a woman in Birmingham drugs who saw someone who looked like Green and or Hastings, and supposedly she looked that person directly in the face. I know it's been 40 some years, but is that woman still alive? And has she been shown pictures of Green and Hastings to see if she can confirm if either is the person?
That's a really good question. That's really interesting. I think the person that I know who sat with the police sketch artist, her name was Lenore Marzilla, I think. Her name is in the book. It would be really, really interesting to track her down and to see if she still remembers that face. You know, I have, there are some people that are convinced that Gregory tried to abduct them, and they're convinced because they looked him in the face and they looked him in the eye. And even though we can't prove whether Gregory Green was out on bond or in jail during that time, you know, these people are convinced because they looked them in the eye. And, you know.
It would look better if he at least placed a quick call to President-elect Biden or left him the traditional note in the Oval. Now, these are traditions that obviously are fluid. They're not required. They encase the more ways that our Constitution requires.
I think that's somebody's TV.
Yeah, okay, I think I took care of it. Sorry for the interruption there.
Oh, don't, God.
So does anyone else have questions for Marnie? This is a fascinating and gut-wrenching story, and it has had to be hard for you at times too. So we appreciate your sharing this with us.
Well, thank you, Dennison. And, you know, thank you to everybody's patience as I worked out my technical difficulties. You know, these things happen.
Yeah.
I would just like to share my website, if that's okay. And
Sure.
people that didn't get a chance to ask questions or want to, you know, pose them to me directly, it's thesnowkillings.com. It's pretty easy. I'd really love to keep the conversation going.
And Marnie, there is one other question I see in the chat. Who was the U.S. Senator involved?
His name was Jack Faxon. He passed away recently.
Hey, Marnie, I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Or just your opinion. So I was a kid when this was all happening, roughly the same age. And my memory at the time was that the media coverage was mostly that this was like a criminal genius that was doing, cleaning the bodies, and it was
Right.
or a cop or a priest or something like that.
Yeah.
And it seemed like, now all the reporting that you've done, and Jay Rubin Appleman and Kathy's uncovered, and Corey, etc. Now the lead suspects are just awful, human beings and not criminal masterminds. Why do you think that it was that way at the time? Or is that just my memory's wrong?
No. I think you're right. I think, um, the feeling that it could be a priest or a minister or a cop was born out of the knowledge that nobody witnessed a kid screaming or being forced into a car. Nobody, and these are 4 kids that in pretty much broad daylight, with the exception of Joe Robinson, that really just were plucked into thin air. So that was, I think, where that theory came from, that the kids must have, maybe a cop flashed a badge or it was a coach that they knew or a minister that they knew. And I think that's where that theory came from. I don't claim to know who the killer was. I don't know that Christopher Bush was the killer. I know that he was involved. And the other curious, thing that I often think about is that even to this day, after Coy Williams' 14 years of work, we don't know where the kids were held. We do not know where the kids were held. And houses have been vacuumed out, and I can only conclude that the kids were used as subjects in the child pornography films. And as I said, it was a multi-million-dollar industry, and I think, as the earlier person Bob was saying, Francis Shelton, these were really, really intelligent but evil people who ran it. They knew how to hide it. I also, Christopher Bush's father, H. Lee, had a vested interest in keeping a lid on all this because of his reputation and because of General Motors. I know that people in General Motors knew that Christopher Bush was a suspect. It had to be somebody who was really smart,
Yeah.
And I guess the reason I blame the cover-up so much is because so much was lost. They could have in 1978 taken those ropes and the shotgun shell that was of the same caliber of the gun that was used, to shoot Joe. And all of it was just lost. It was just, so, but people are coming forward, witnesses are coming forward, and it's, I have a lot of hope.
Well, and Marnie, thank you for sharing your website too. So
Okay.
People can stay connected if they have questions, or clearly there are folks who have very detailed memories of the time, and people have asked some very, very detailed questions, and
Yeah.
so that's good. I appreciate your sharing that too.
Sure.
Well, and any final questions for Marnie? Marnie, thank you so much again.
Thank you, Dennis. I really apologize for the technical difficulties.
No, we were able to work through all of these, and so there are glories and curses with this format, and yes.
Yes.
that sometimes we have technical problems. So on behalf of the library, again, we thank you all for attending. I encourage you to keep an eye on the library's website, the Facebook page, and sign up for our email lists. People post it in as many ways as we can think of upcoming programs. So we encourage you to do that too. And thank you again tonight. And again, Marnie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.